So one of my longtime subscribers that asked me, what's really the difference between the E-M10 Mark II and the Olympus Pen F? So I'm going to go over some of the differences between the two cameras and go a little bit in depth in terms of the features that this camera has that the Olympus E-M10 Mark II does not. Because on paper, when you look at these cameras, there's really doesn't seem to be a lot of differences, right? They're both Micro Four Thirds, they both have like the same viewfinder, and a lot of the same features, focus bracketing, live composite, etc. But the Olympus Pen F really, I think, is a much more creative camera, and it's very, very JPEG centric, and will allow you to do a lot more things in the field with this camera that you can't do with the E-M10 Mark II. So let's go over some of the obvious differences between the two cameras. This is your typical DSLR type style camera, and this is more of your rangefinder style type camera. And in terms of some other physical things, this has more buttons and dials on it, so you have more direct access and control to a lot of the features without having to dive into the menus as much as you would on the E-M10 Mark II. And then also this has the fully articulating screen, versus this has the standard tilt screen, like you find on a lot of cameras. And honestly, for photography, I prefer the tilt screen over the articulating screen. And then for video, I prefer the articulating screen. But physically speaking, that's really the only differences between the two cameras. Now, in general, the features are pretty much the same. The only differences really being is this is a 20 megapixel camera, this is a 16 megapixel. They both have 5-axis image stabilization, and they have the same viewfinder resolution, if not the exact same viewfinder inside, and the same TruePic 7 processing engine. So the colors and everything you get out of it should be exactly the same in terms of the raw files and the natural color profile. So in terms of ultimate image quality, they're pretty much the same. This will give you a little better because of the 20 megapixels and it's slightly better ISO performance. But we're really splitting hairs, and we have to be taking pictures near the extreme limits of each camera to really see the differences. Just day-to-day shooting, you're really not going to see much difference. Now, the signature difference with the Pen F is really the creative dial on the front. And that's what really takes this camera to a different level than any other camera on the market, I think. It really lets you do a lot of things in the field that you would have to do in post-processing if you were, say, shooting with the Olympus E-M10 Mark II. On paper, when you look at these online, and I did a little research beforehand, I was like, if anybody were looking at these two cameras online, you really wouldn't see much difference other than, like I said, the sensor. This one shoots a little bit faster, frames per second. Like I think this will do 10 or 11 frames per second versus this will do like 8. This has a 1/8,000th of a second maximum mechanical shutter speed versus this one is 1/4000th. So there's very subtle differences. I mean, probably not enough for to make you want to buy this camera over this if you were just looking at the feature sets. But having owned both of these cameras now for almost 3 years, I can tell you there is quite a bit of difference in some of the features if you use them. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into that. I think the first place to start is in the menu system, where you'll see how this camera starts to differentiate itself from the E-M10 Mark II. So if we go into the menu and look at the shooting menu number 1, there's absolutely no difference here. All of the settings are pretty much identical at this point. But when we go into shooting menu number 2, there's actually 2 things here in the menu that the Pen F has that the E-M10 Mark X does not. And the first one I can't really show you because I'm recording the screen, but it's in the bracketing menu. Both of these cameras have focus bracketing, whereby the camera will take multiple images and step the focusing along the way so that you can bracket these focusing, stack them back together in post, and get an image sharp from front to back. And this is very handy for particularly in macro work or close-up photography. Both these cameras can do focus bracketing, not focus stacking, which the E-M1 Mark II does, but it will bracket the shot so that you can post-process these into a single image. However, The EM10, the Pen F here has an additional feature in the bracketing, focus bracketing, that allows you to use flash with focus bracketing. And I think it's called pre-charge delay or something like that, whereby before it takes the next picture sequence, you can set a delay time to give your flash time to recycle and recharge to fire for the next shot. Versus the E-M10 Mark II, it doesn't have that feature. It just takes like 10 or 99 pictures as fast as it can, whereas the Pen F, you can set a little delay between each picture to give the flash time to recharge. And you know, using flash photography in macro work especially is very, very handy, and that's a creative choice in this camera, a feature that you're not going to find on the E-M10 Mark II. Another feature in this menu here, and you'll see it near the bottom here, is the high-res shot mode. This camera has the high-res shot feature, which allows you to take 50 megapixel JPEGs, or I think 80 megapixel RAWs. And you can do some creative things with high-res shot mode other than getting more detail. And I did a video on that using a waterfall as an example, and I'll put a link to that up here as well. But yeah, this has high-res shot mode, this one does not. And in terms of image stabilization, both these cameras have 5-axis image stabilization. They're both very good, but in video, the Pen F 5-axis stabilization is definitely superior, far and above the E-M10 Mark II. I mean, I can walk around with this camera handheld and get fairly steady shots, versus with the E-M10 Mark II, it's not as easy walking around. And I did a video comparing the image stabilization between these two cameras that you can check out as well. Okay, so let's go back into the menu. And let's see, the next feature here is actually down here in menu E, the exposure and ISO menu. And these are pretty much exactly the same, except here in the ISO auto set. Now when I go over to the ISO auto set, we have two line items here, versus on the E-M10 Mark II, if you go in the ISO auto set, it takes you right to the upper limit and default. But on the Pen F, you get two line items here. So it has a more sophisticated auto ISO system, whereby you can tell the auto ISO to not go below a certain shutter speed. And you can set this all the way up to the maximum of 1/8,000th of a second if you want. All right, the next thing that both these cameras have is spot metering. And that allows you to meter for light on the center 2 or 3% of the frame, so that you can expose properly, say for someone's face, which, like even in this image here, my face is only covering maybe 5% of the frame. So I can expose properly for my face and not worry about the rest of the frame. But on the Olympus Pen F, you can adjust where the spot metering is based on the focus point. So with the E-M10 Mark II, I have to spot meter, like if I was in the frame, I would spot meter here, then recompose the shot. So if I want to do a rule of thirds type thing, I would lock the exposure and focus and recompose and then take the picture. On the Pen F, you can change that, so it's easier to demonstrate, and it's in the same menu, I believe, right here. Whoops. Here's the spot metering, which is on the both cameras, and we can change this to matrix, center, spot. So when we use spot metering though, this line item here, spot metering, is not available on the E-M10 Mark II. And I've checked the little box here for spot, and it also has spot highlight and spot shadow, which I'll talk about maybe in another video. But when I have this box checked, now when I'm metering, if I change the focus point, like right now I'm on this white brick, so the exposure drops down to expose for the brick. But if I move over here to the sofa, you can see it raised the exposure quite a bit, and now the image is much brighter because it's trying to expose for the sofa versus the white wall. And as I move this around, you can see how it changes, like so. So now I don't have to focus and recompose. I can focus and take the picture if I selected the focus point, either manually with the little D-pad on the back, or if I just touch the screen on the back for the focus point. So that's something that this camera can do that this one cannot. Another unique feature to the Olympus Pen F, or a feature that this has that this camera does not, is what they call the lens info setting. And that is in the menu over here, I believe down here in the utility menu. And all of this is the same, but if we go further down, we have something called lens info settings. And if I click over here, I can program into the Pen F the specific lens information that will be burned into the EXIF data of the image file. And this is very, very handy if you like to adapt, vintage lenses or different kinds of lenses. So one of the default settings here is the 9mm f8 fisheye body cap lens, because that lens doesn't have any electrical contact. So when you put it on the camera, it has no idea what lens you put on it. So you can go in here and tell it that, yeah, I put on a 9mm body cap lens, and then when you import these photos into your Lightroom or Capture One, whatever you use, that lens data will be there so that you know that picture was taken with what lens, assuming you pick the correct one in the lens info setting. And you can program up to 10 different values, and you can name them whatever you want. So have a naming convention in mind before you start adding a bunch of lenses, so down the road, it'll be a little bit more useful. But I just wanted to give you a feel for what that was. The other very handy thing here is you can put in the focal length of the lens. Now what that does is, now with both cameras, you can adapt lenses and you can set the focal length for the image stabilization to work properly. So for example, down here, if I click the info button, if I was putting on, say, a 35mm vintage lens on the E-M10, I could just change this to 35 and we're set. And I would do that on either camera. But with the Pen F, if I program the lens data in, all I'd have to do is go into the lens info setting and select the 35mm f1.6 lens, which is what I have on this camera now. And now, when I go into the image stabilization settings, it automatically sets the focal length of the lens to whatever you programmed into the lens info data. So that's very, very handy, especially if you have several different vintage lenses that you bring with you and you're swapping. You don't have to make notes separately, like in a little book like this, what lens you use for what picture. You can do it right in camera. And this is something that the E-M5 Mark II does not have, or any of the E-M10s or any of the other Olympus cameras, with the exception of the E-M1. I think the Mark I and the Mark II both have that, and of course now the E-M1X have this feature. But this is very, very handy in the field as well, and in your workflow, if you like to adapt lenses. Another significant thing on the Pen F that really takes custom modes to the next level over the E-M10 Mark II is the the Pen F has the custom modes right here on the mode dial directly as C1, C2, C3, and C4. And you can do similar on the E-M10 Mark II, and I do personally for my professional work. I reprogram the mode dial, scene mode, and art modes to other things when I'm doing my real estate photography. And that's very, very handy, but the Pen F can program for each custom mode, like C1, you can have different settings for each different mode on the creative dial. So what I mean by that is, if I were to put this into, say, the color mode on the creative dial, I can save all of the settings in this particular setting on the mode dial versus this setting when it's off. So what does that mean exactly? Well, in the color mode dial, you have, for example, up to 3 different color profiles. There's color 1, 2, and 3. And I can save 3 different color profiles into C1. And then I can go into C2 and I can program a different set of color profiles, or 3 color profiles. And I can do that for C3 and C4. So I can save up to, if you take 4 times 3, I can save up to 12 different color profiles into the C1 through C4 on the Pen F. And one example is, I have color profile 1 set to Kodachrome 25. I might have color profile 2 set to like a Fuji, film simulation, and then color profile 3 set to, maybe some kind of Ektachrome or something. So if you really like to play with the colors in the color profile mode, and I'll talk about that in another video, you can save up to 12 different ones along with some other settings. And then I can do the same thing when I go into monochrome, the mono mode on the creative dial. I can save an additional 12 different settings. All right, so there's monochrome 1, 2, and 3, and then I can save that into C1, then I can go into C2 and save a different set of monochrome profiles. So you can see, I can't do the math in my head, but you can see you can save multiple settings in C1 through C4, whereas on the E-M10 Mark II, you're pretty much limited to 4 different settings. Whereas this one, you can probably do, 20 or 30 different settings. I couldn't possibly keep track of that, so I'd have to write down all the different ones into a book and then set it. But again, it's something you do in the field that will help you to see things creatively in the field versus, shooting raw and then going back and post-processing. Because me personally, I like to do it in the field and see how things look with the lighting conditions and everything as they are. It's very difficult in post-processing to take an image that really didn't have the right lighting or mood to begin with, versus when you're actually in the field. I think it's a lot more intuitive to do it in the field in the camera. But that's one thing. Okay, so the other thing with these creative dials, okay, now both of these cameras have the color creator dial, and that's over here on the Pen F. Wait, that's art mode. Okay, here's the color creator. So the color creator, these two are exactly the same, and all it does is add a tint of color to the image overall. And I can increase the saturation, from 0 to +3. And both of these cameras do that. However, the Pen F, when you're in color creator dial or mode here, when you go into the super control panel, you can change the white balance while you're in color creator, versus on the E-M10 Mark II, the white balance is fixed to auto. And I can tell you, when I was doing my creative flower photography, and I have another video coming out with the Pen F when I'm doing that. I haven't finished that one yet. But it's very, very handy to be able to control the white balance separately from the tint of the color creator. So that's something that it's really, you're not going to find in the manual or anything like that. Or hear about from anyone other than somebody that's owned both of these cameras for a while. And I'm sure there's other things that there's settings in this camera that are more flexible in this way, in a similar way, that the E-M10 cannot do. But that's one that I found that I found useful, having that flexibility of being able to control other settings while I'm in different modes. Another thing is the monochrome mode on the Pen F. It has a dedicated mono profile 1, 2, and 3. And it's a little bit beyond me, honestly, the subtle differences between the black and whites on the E-M10 and the Pen F. But others have said, yeah, there's a difference. And all I can do is tell you that, using this little jog dial on the top, is the Pen F has the same color filters as the E-M10 Mark II, but the Pen F gives you a little bit more fine tuning. The E-M10 Mark II only has black and white filters like red, green, yellow, and green. It has those 4. Whereas the Pen F has 8 different color filters. And in addition to having 8 different color filters, it lets you adjust the intensity of each color filter. So you definitely have more creative control in your black and whites over the E-M10 Mark II. The other thing is, when you apply grain to the black and white images. You can apply grain in camera on the E-M10 Mark II, but supposedly the grain pattern on the on the Pen F has a certain more film-like look to it, meaning the grain pattern is a little bit different in the shadows than it is in the highlights, and there's a very subtle change in the grain pattern when the light changes within the frame. And that's supposed to give it, like I said, that more film-like look to it. And again, it's something a little bit beyond my eyes to be able to see, but there are people that do appreciate those kinds of things and have said that, yeah, I can get black and white images out of this Pen F that I can't get out of any other camera. And I think it's due to that sort of processing that they've built into the Pen F, in addition to all of the other things that they've done. So that's one thing. And then one other thing here is with this jog dial here on the back is I can control highlights and shadows on either camera. But with the Pen F, it's easier because of the jog dial, you know, having more buttons and all. But I can also click the info button and also control the midtones. And that's something that I cannot do on the E-M10 Mark II. The E-M10 Mark II only has highlight and shadow, but you can do a little bit more with the midtones. And that's why I think the Pen F, it gives you so much more control, lets you save so many more, you know, different types of custom settings. You know, when I'm in the color mode, and I did a video on how I coded in the Kodachrome 25 colors, you know, and Fujifilm, you can control the saturation of each individual color, like so. And again, this is something for people that are much more creative than I am. You can go online and there's in the forums, like at the MU43 forum, there's a couple of threads on going for different looks by controlling the saturation, and hopefully in a firmware, Olympus will let us control also the hue and luminance of each individual color. If they're not going to come out with a Pen F2, please come out with a firmware update that lets us control those as well. And it's something, again, they can just add in addition to the jog dial. Another thing that you can do with this jog dial that you really can't do on the E-M10 is you have the vignetting control here. So if I want a little lighter vignette or if I want a darker vignette, I can do that to any image via the jog dial on this camera. So some interesting trivia about this camera that, you know, I found out when I was researching it was that Olympus never intended this camera to be a long-running camera. They they wanted this camera to be a one-off type special camera. So version 2 was never really in the works from day one. Now we can assume if it sold like gangbusters, yeah, they would probably come out with a version 2. But it was never the intent when they first produced this camera. And you know, I think they've done a good job with it. I really like, you know, I think it's just a beautiful camera. Now, another interesting thing about this camera was the articulating screen that they have here. They didn't put this on the camera for any kind of marketing reasons, you know, that have a fully articulating screen so people could do selfies or do video. Because if they were serious about video with this camera, they would have put a mic jack on it, because there's definitely room for one over here on the side. The reason they gave this an articulating screen is because they wanted the new owner, when they purchase this camera and take it out of the box, they wanted the camera to come out with the screen closed flat back up against the camera like this, so that the grain or the texture here is showing, to give it a very nostalgic film camera kind of feel and look to it. And that was the reasoning for putting an articulating screen on this versus, you know, a tilt screen, which arguably is better for photography. Because if you had a tilt screen on, then, you know, you would have this 3-inch display showing on the back of the camera when you took it out of the box. Olympus didn't want that. They wanted to do it this way so that it had this nostalgic feel to it.